In the United States of America, the history of capital punishment is a history of method. Their origins reflect the diverse values of a vast country. 50 states, each with their own traditions, laws, and even religious sensibilities. In the 21st century, 5 different methods of execution are still available. Many states offer the condemned a choice, and the method of execution has been a major factor in dictating the role of the executioner and the type of man who could carry out this fearsome responsibility. But for a society that continues to pursue the death sentence, its practitioners have remained far more shadowy figures than their European counterparts, even though their work has always been by a handful of selected witnesses. Few executioners sought publicity, and whether by coincidence or not, many had unhappy ends. The earliest were mostly lawmen, and the death they dispensed was by the rope. You are hereby cordially invited to attend the hanging of one George Smiley, murderer. His soul will be swung into eternity on December 8th, 1899 at 2:00 p.m. sharp. The latest improved methods in the art of scientific strangulation will be employed, and everything possible will be done to make the surroundings cheerful and the execution a success. F.J. Watron, Sheriff of Navajo County. But hangings were rarely scientific or cheerful. Unlike the English, who introduced hanging to the New World and eventually refined the long drop method in Britain, American sheriffs were generally poor hangmen, and it was not a job they welcomed or relished.
Unless a person had hanged a great number of people, the chances are that he didn't know what he was doing, and it was very, very easy to bungle a hanging. You could have too long a drop and their feet would touch the ground. You could have too short a drop and they would simply strangle to death over a period of time.
Novel attempts were made to mechanize the process.
There was something that was used called the jerk-em-up gallows, where the prisoner was catapulted up, and so the break happened on the way up. And they were very ineffective, and they tended to cause extreme pain.
Some of these devices even made the condemned man his own executioner.
I believe the cowboy Tom Horn had to balance on a water weight such that the moment he lost his balance, he hanged himself. I don't believe it ever reached the Supreme Court, but there were legal challenges raised to various methods that involved the prisoner killing himself, because in this country, suicide is illegal. So you were compelling the man to break the law by having him kill himself. There would be quite a number of gallows that were set up, even in the Old West, where 3 people would cut strings. One of them only would be the one that would actually affect the drop.
But there was one man who attempted to bring skill and humanity to American hangings: the wealthy Illinois farmer George Philip Hanna. Born in 1873, Hanna suffered from algophobia, a morbid and irrational fear of pain.
When he was a young man, he witnessed a bungle hanging, and he decided that it was simply unfair to kill a man in such a manner. And he went home and made an individual study of heights and weights and drops.
About 2 years after he had begun his self-training, he went to a nearby county to witness a hanging, and the sheriff was bungling it. He could tell by the way that he'd put the noose on. There was a crowd of 20,000 people, and he walked up to this 21-year-old kid and said, "Sir, can I help you? You're doing this all wrong." And the sheriff was all too happy to, relieve himself of responsibility, so Hanna hanged him And then he became famous, and he was sought after by hangmen all across America.
Hannah drank frequently and admitted to being a nervous wreck in the days immediately before and after an execution. But he always told the condemned the same thing: "I am here to help you."
The county it was in was shut down. Nobody farmed. The stores were closed down. Seats were bought and sold for proximity to the gallows. And it was supposed to be a good show. And in some ways, he deprived them of that.
But there were accidents. In 1920, when he dropped James Johnson, the rope broke. Johnson was severely injured. "Hurry up, boys," he pleaded, "and get me out of my misery."
I don't think he met with any ostracism or anything like that, and I think people realized that he was doing what he was doing for humanitarian reasons. They were going to execute him anyway.
But Hannah, who supported the death penalty, disliked being called the hangman. And in one sense, he wasn't.
He never actually hanged anybody. He would only put the noose on. He could never bring himself to spring the trapdoor.
In 1936, Hannah supervised his 70th hanging, the last official public execution in American history. Rainey Bethea was hanged in front of 20,000 people in Owensboro, Kentucky.
Crowds gathered from all over the United States, newsmen from all over the world. The state was publicly excoriated because of it, and it was more than they could take.
Not long afterwards, Hannah's wife left him. He became seriously ill and died in 1948, age 75. But despite his legacy, the reputation of American hangmen was never good. And the actions of one would eventually shock the world. They were the most infamous criminals of the 20th century, the architects of genocide, and the first men in history to be tried for crimes against humanity.
The International Military Tribunal sentences you to death by hanging.
11 of Hitler's elite were sentenced to face the hangman, and controversy surrounding their executions has raged ever since. The executioner was Master Sergeant John C. Woods, without doubt America's most prolific hangman. As the Army's official executioner, he'd hanged more than 300 men and women, many of them the most notorious war criminals. And yet, surprisingly little is known of him. Even with his comrades, Woods was an intensely private man. "Some people don't like what I do for a living," was the most he'd offer. A Texan, he claimed to have started assisting a hangman in San Antonio. The hangman was his neighbor. Woods had a reputation as a hard drinker, prone to violent outbursts. Despite this, the US Army considered him to be a thorough professional, a real by-the-book man. Woods had always striven to maintain an emotional detachment from the condemned. Their crimes and the justness of the sentence was not his concern. When it came to the Nuremberg executions, it appears the hangman forgot his own rules. The executions were planned and conducted in unprecedented secrecy. Woods supervised the construction of the 3 sets of gallows. The soldiers who transported them to Nuremberg feared the job would bring them bad luck. Arguably, for Woods, it did. On the 16th of October 1946, an international tribunal of witnesses assembled inside the blacked-out gymnasium at Nuremberg's Palace of Justice.
It was just 7 minutes after 1 o'clock when the American Sergeant Wood and his assistant mounted the first platform and took up their positions with rope and hood. To 8 correspondents, it was a harrowing, difficult assignment to watch these men die.
But military photographs, initially withheld from the public, show wounds and contortions not normally associated with a long drop hanging where the vertebrae is crushed, causing instantaneous death. Reporters, especially the British, were scathing in their account of the executions. Some claimed Woods had built the traps too small and that they struck the prisoners as they fell. Others that the drops were too short, causing prolonged and unnecessary suffering. There were even claims that Woods was seen stepping behind the black drapes with a club. Had Woods bungled the hangings? The most controversial execution was that of Julius Streicher. Where most of the prisoners had gone quietly to their fate, Streicher saluted, shouting, "Heil Hitler!" Refusing to give his name, Streicher cursed the tribunal. "The Bolsheviks will hang you one day," was his last oath. According to Second Lieutenant Stanley Tills, Woods was visibly incensed. The hangman had lost several friends in the massacre of POWs at Malmedy during the Battle of the Bulge, and had developed a pathological hatred of the Nazis. Tills later wrote, "Woods adjusted the noose, but placed its coils off-center, so it would not snap Streicher's neck and he'd strangle. I realized instantly that this was Woods' intent, and I saw a small smile cross his lips as he pulled the hangman's handle. Streicher's gasps and gurgles filled the chamber. Everyone heard his gasps, and everyone denied hearing them.
Streicher took death with difficulty 12.5 minutes after the trap was sprung.
It was a grim note to end history's grimmest chapter. Despite the criticism, Woods boasted to reporters, "I hanged those 10 Nazis and I'm proud of it." But he was never called on to perform another execution. In 1954, in a macabre twist of fate, the former hangman was struck by an electric power line. He died instantly, at the age of 41. More Americans died by the rope than any other method, but it was always considered a brutal and revolting method of capital punishment. And as early as 1890, New Yorkers turned to a scientific wonder to deliver death. In 1874, Thomas Edison harnessed an elemental force of nature and stunned the world with bottled light. Electricity was the marvel of the age, but it had a dark side too. It could be lethal. On August the 6th, 1890, inside New York's Auburn prison, they unveiled the electric chair.
Now, electrocution started off with a bad name. The first victim of the electric chair was a man named William Kimmler. And he was literally cooked to a crisp.
Witnesses were horrified. Some fainted, others fled. Kimmler survived the first surge and had to be shocked again. The press branded it torture, but the experiments continued. The first electrocutioners, as they were known, were not lawmen. They were electricians, skilled men, technicians. And one of the earliest became the most famous executioner in American history, Robert Green Elliott. The only American executioner of historical note to write his memoirs.
Oh, he was by far the most prolific American executioner that we know of.
Well, he became famous because he executed several hundred people.
Born in 1874, the New York farm boy's parents had wanted him to be a preacher, but Eliot was fascinated by the mysteries of electricity, and equally fascinated by the execution of William Kemmler. In 1903, whilst working as a prison electrician, he became an assistant to the man who put Kemmler to death, Edwin Davis. Secretive to the point of paranoia, Davis became furious with Eliot if he even addressed him by his name in public. He was also paranoid about what he saw as his trade secrets.
When Davis was on the verge of retirement, they were trying to get him to train other people, but also to share the secrets of his electrodes, which is preposterous when you think about it. It's a metal disc inside a sponge, and there ain't much more to it. But he got them to cough up $10,000, which would probably be, I don't know, a 10-year salary average in those days, to buy his electrodes. And then he trained two men who became the next two executioners. Between the three of them, they killed close to 1,000 men.
Eliot eventually took over the post of executioner for New York State in 1926. For the first year, he remained virtually anonymous, until he conducted 2 executions that shook the world. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants. Active in the anarchist movement, they were convicted on purely circumstantial evidence of murder during a payroll robbery. Many believed them innocent, martyrs for a political movement. The sentence of death led to massive protests throughout America and Europe.
There's an interesting part of his memoirs where he talks about coming out of the prison, where it's a fantastic number of people, 25,000 people were there. And of his just sort of walking unknown out of the prison, and of his sense of power, of just being aware of being at the center of this enormous event.
Eliot began to receive hate mail.
You are a disgrace to your family and to all mankind. It is bad enough.
I think you are the worst specimen of a man. Everybody should shun you like they would some awful creature. You are not fit to live.
Before every well-known execution that he carried out, he did receive death threats in the mail.
He didn't take them seriously. A few months later, Eliot's house was bombed. Miraculously, no one was hurt. The bomber was never found.
From then on, I believe there was a police booth outside his house until the day he died.
And later, Eliot learned his immediate predecessor, John Hurlburt, had committed suicide. Eliot claimed he didn't believe it had anything to do with Hurlburt's job as executioner. Others weren't so sure. Either way, a defiant Eliot continued as an agent of death. He became the last word in many of America's most sensational crimes, including Bruno Hauptmann, convicted of killing the baby son of aviation hero Charles Lindbergh.
Flash, United Press, Trenton, Hauptmann executed, 8:47 1/2.
And when the publicity came, he didn't shy away from it. Eliot was not without a certain vanity. He lived well and he dressed well. He could afford to. Eliot made a small fortune from executions. At the height of the Depression, he was paid $150 per prisoner. As his fame spread, his services were called for all over the northeastern seaboard. New Jersey, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Connecticut. Sometimes he executed as many as 6 men in one day. But Eliot doesn't seem to have been plagued with qualms of conscience. If anything, he sincerely believed his technical skill gave his clients an easier death.
He did, in his heart of hearts, believe that the electric chair, if administered properly, i.e. by him, was the only humanitarian method of doing it.
"2,000 volts surged into the prisoner. It was here that Eliot believed his real skills came into play. Regulating the voltage was what made the difference between a successful execution or a nightmare. Too much voltage and the prisoner would literally burn. Not enough, and they might remain conscious. Run the current too long, and the prisoner would cook. Death row inmates called it riding the lightning. 5 seconds after the initial shock, Elliot would drop the voltage to just under 1,000 volts. Without this decrease, sparks appeared around the electrodes, giving the chair its nickname, Old Sparky. But unlike cinema portrayals, it was a complete myth that the prison lights dimmed. The chair was supplied by a completely separate generator. Elliot would repeat the process, shocking the prisoner for up to 2.5 minutes. But was Elliot's faith in the chair justified?
Well, I've been involved with many, and I have seen a small amount of smoke, and that's the most I've ever seen. You hear all these stories about, stuff that went on, but I never saw it.
His body burns, there's no doubt about it. There's disfiguration. He bleeds from the nose and the mouth.
I actually never paid a lot of attention to the witnesses because I was watching the man that was being executed, I'm told that some of them has fainted and some of them, shed tears and whatnot.
However, I am thoroughly convinced that when the first jolt hits, that a man is brain dead within 1/700th of a second.
The electric chair may or may not be humane. There have been 2 people who survived it, and their accounts are certainly not of humaneness.
It's probably not as humane as the needle, but these people that were being murdered or raped or tortured by the people that's being executed, that wasn't humane when they was doing what they did either.
Towards the end of his career, Elliot became ill and frail. In his memoirs, he claimed to be a staunch opponent of capital punishment, arguing, "You have done this with your laws."
He just believed it did no good, but he felt that he was the one that could deliver these men with least pain and greatest speed.
There was, he said, no vengeance in his heart. Certainly, he showed compassion towards the prisoners, sometimes visiting them on death row and trying to offer comfort. He even took food prepared by his wife. On October the 10th, 1939, 3 days after approving the final chapter of his memoirs, America's most famous and richest executioner died of cancer at the age of 66. The electric chair did not die with him, but it would face a rival. In the early 20th century, in common with many other states, Nevada had become uneasy with hanging. It decided to offer condemned prisoners the same choice as its neighbor, Utah, hanging or firing squad. But Utah had adopted firing squads for an altogether different reason. It was sacred to their religion. Utah is a Mormon state. In Genesis 9:6, the Bible says, "Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed." And Mormons must have a method of execution that spills blood.
Incidentally, Utah's original death penalty statute applied for decapitation. I do not know whether it was by guillotine or how, but it provided for decapitation.
Execution by firing squad is a relatively simple method, long preferred by the military. A target is pinned over the prisoner's heart. A team of riflemen take aim and fire. How much pain is suffered by the prisoner is a moot question. In civil executions, the shooters are generally lawmen, hidden from view. One rifle is loaded with a blank bullet. Theoretically, each man can absolve himself of responsibility for the killing. But in practice, no experienced rifleman could be fooled. When a blank is used, the kickback is less than with a live round, and the barrel remains cooler. Utah retained the firing squad, but Nevada used it only once, in 1913. In 1924, it introduced a brand new system of execution: poisonous gas. An army physician, Major Delos Turner, had studied the effects of gas attacks during the First World War. He believed he could rid the process of its repulsive features and put a man to sleep with the same ease as a surgeon.
And it was originally determined to execute a man while he was asleep, just to let the gas ooze out and kill him while he was asleep.
The prisoner, in a special airtight cell, wouldn't even know the date of his execution. And there lay a crucial constitutional issue.
It was called cruel and unusual punishment. And the only thing that was unusual about it was that it was killing a man in his sleep, which would be, how could you get more humane? The guy goes to sleep and wakes up wherever he wakes up.
So they set up a gas chamber wherein a person was seated and strapped down and gassed.
Its first victim was a Chinaman, G. John, who was put to death inside a converted barber shop in Nevada's Carson City State Prison. The gas was pumped by 3 prison warders who'd been chosen by lottery. Some of their colleagues had resigned to avoid it. John took several minutes to die, his head bobbing spasmodically. Prisoners would call it the Big Sleep. In theory, it sounded the simplest and cleanest of deaths. One man who should know is Donald Hokut. Hokut was 21 when he became a guard at Parchman, home to Mississippi's death row.
Of course, the first thing you do is you want to see the gas chamber. It's designed like a big tank with windows in it. And it's got a door on it like a submarine with a big wheel on it. And then it's got exhaust fans and all kinds of gauges and things. You know, it looks like something that Jules Verne may have dreamed up.
Hokut was given responsibility for the chamber's maintenance.
You know, I had my choice to refuse or not, but I chose to do it because I was very interested in it, 21 years old. Oh, man. I was very interested in what went on back there, you know.
The mechanics of the chamber sound deceptively simple. Cyanide, mixed with a solution of sulfuric acid and water, produces hydrocyanic gas, killing the prisoner. But in fact, it's technically the most complicated method of execution ever devised. And any mistakes could prove lethal for the executioners. Protective clothing and gas masks have to be worn just to prepare the chemicals. The chamber itself must be airtight. All window and door seals have to be checked.
The day of the execution, you go and you take tubs of Vaseline and you rub it around those gaskets on the inside and outside to make sure they stay soft where they won't leak. You pull a negative vacuum with a fan on top of the gas chamber, and you got to gauge, let the executioner know and the chemical man know that you've got a negative vacuum and there's no chance of it leaking out. We do a candle test. You close the gas chamber, you turn on the exhaust fan, and you take the candle and you go around the windows and seeing if it pulls to the outside. So if that flame goes to the outside, and it would tell you of a leak.
Even after the execution, there are still serious risks for the executioner. The gas leaves a powdery residue in the chamber. To counter it, everything is sprayed with ammonia, including the body.
To protect the people that are going in there to get him. You know, there's a possibility of just a little pocket of gas or gas in that uniform that he had on or whatever, but he's washed down in the chair to make sure that all of the residue is gone. And then he's removed from there and his clothes are changed.
Without this precaution, anyone touching the body, such as the undertaker, could be killed.
The task of the executioner actually is just to pull a pin and flip a lever. And when you pull that lever, it drops the cyanide crystals into the sulfuric acid, and then they say it's colorless, but it's not. I could see it. It's a little dingy yellow color to it, and it fills the chamber. Once you breathe this stuff, that's it.
The question is, what sort of death does this elaborate and risky procedure deliver?
It's sometimes referred to as the chemical garrote. The body is tricked into absorbing cyanide rather than oxygen. And so the man begins to strangle on a cellular level.
You just smother to death. I would say a minute, maybe less than that, even 30 seconds, he's unconscious. Then it takes time for his body to die.
There's nothing humane about it. It burns a person's nostrils, his throat, his lungs, and it takes several minutes to do so.
Hokut was present at the controversial execution of Jimmy Lee Gray.
Jimmy Lee Gray was put in the chamber and executed according with policy, and protocol. But his head banged against a pole behind the chair.
Some of the witnesses claim that he strangled and suffered up to the 11th minute. Almost everyone in there had a panicked reaction. My God, what's happening? We're supposed to be doing this in a humane way, and here's this guy in a place where we can no longer get to him, suffering at our hands.
Such incidents led to a search for yet another, more humane method of execution. But what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment? And what does it mean to those who deliver it? As early as 1835, the carnival atmosphere of gallows crowds was considered demoralizing by Pennsylvanian authorities, and public executions were abolished. Though a small number of witnesses would be admitted inside stockades or prisons to see the sentence of the law had been carried out. But it would take a century before all states followed suit, and it was the South that held on to public executions the longest. Officially, the last took place in 1936 in Kentucky. Unofficially, they continued even longer. In 1939, Mississippi dispensed with hanging in favor of the electric chair. But Sunflower County refused to house it. Residents feared that Sunflower would become known as the Death County. The solution was a portable electric chair and the arrival of the traveling executioner. Hilton Butler worked as an assistant to a traveling executioner.
Well, in 1955, I was assigned as a young officer to go around to where the crime was committed, the chair was transported to wherever the crime was committed at that time. You had the generator and the chair in this truck that looked like a refrigeration truck looks today.
It was a simple thing to go from county seat to county seat to electrocute the man.
I went with it one time to Oak Grove, Louisiana, which was my hometown, and it was actually set in a jail cell.
People still felt that it had a deterrent value, and by having it locally, it satisfied the crowd, the morbid crowd.
Butler had travelled the same roads as the notorious tattooed executioner, Jimmy Thompson.
Jimmy Thompson in Mississippi, who was the traveling electrocutioner, had a long career of petty crime. He was actually pardoned to become the state traveling electrocutioner.
If the authorities had wanted to put on a show, they couldn't have picked a better man. Amongst other things, Thompson had been a stage hypnotist under the names of Dr. Zog and Dr. Stingaree.
When he brought the chair to show in the state capitol at Jackson, he created a bit of a horror show because he had all these kids and he was, demonstrating everything except for the actual victim. He was asked to tone it down, but he couldn't. He had to put on a good show.
By all accounts, Thompson loved the work and took pride in it, promising prisoners the prettiest death a guy can have. In 1952, he met his own death in a car crash on the roads he so often travelled to bring it to others. As in prisons, travelling executions were conducted just after midnight.
Well, I would just imagine that was to, keep the public from being involved. You had your witnesses and your coroner and your sheriff and people like that. Executions were not open to the public.
But if you knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody, you could go to these things. I mean, I know of executions in Mississippi in the 40s where there were hundreds of people inside the courthouse where they actually did that particular execution.
Many victims of both travelling and prison executions were black, and many were executed for rape without murder. In Georgia alone, of 66 men executed for rape, 63 were black. By the 1960s, such statistics led to a furious legal debate about the application of the death sentence.
The Supreme Court decided that it was not constitutional for the simple reason that some people were more likely to get it than others. If you were black, you were more likely to be electrocuted. It was not used in any consistent manner.
Opponents to the death penalty argued it violated the Constitution's 8th Amendment, which forbids cruel and unusual punishment. Race wasn't the only issue that fueled the debate. Condemned prisoners were spending years on death row, waiting to suffer a variety of execution methods that were frequently appalling spectacles. California's Supreme Court said the death penalty degrades and dehumanizes all who participate in its processes. From 1967, for a decade, rulings by the Supreme Courts effectively abolished capital punishment. But political maneuvering led to its reintroduction in 1977. And two significant changes would affect the role of the executioner. The first was a brand new method devised in Oklahoma. The state's electric chair would cost $62,000 to update. A new gas chamber would cost $200,000. They opted for a much cheaper system, lethal injection. With echoes of the gas chamber, it would, claim proponents, be like putting someone to sleep.
But that's for the public. That's not for the man on the table. It's not any better for him. That's for the public to see, well, we executed this man in the most humane way he could have been executed.
There's no way of knowing what's happening to that man inside his body. Might very well be a 2 to 10 minute chemical entombment, where a man is essentially in a chemical tomb and slowly, being tortured to death.
You could just as easily shot him, hung him, whatever, drown him. You still got to put him to death.
Lethal injection accelerated the process of institutionalizing executions. Private executioners were increasingly replaced with prison staff. In some cases, the very men who worked on death row, executioners could know the man they would eventually kill for years.
I didn't personally get involved with the inmates that was to be executed like a lot of people do, because I didn't want to have any personal feelings in it when it come time to do my job,
But you get to talking to these guys, you get to seeing them, you can't help but develop some sort of relationship with them, like Edward Earl Johnson was as good an inmate as I ever dealt with. And when he went into the gas chamber, personally, I just didn't really want to, I had some feelings about that, but they didn't override what he had done and what we had to do.
And there is frequently another uncomfortable consequence of the institutional executioner's work.
I met their mothers, their grandmothers, their brothers, sisters, nieces, cousins. If there's any feelings I had about it, it was for their family and for the family of the victim, Of course, death row and maximum security itself was deathly quiet. And the other inmates in the prison, it put tension on them because they were under an institutional lockdown. Nothing was moving. As it got closer to the time to do it, people became nervous. Some you could actually see were rattled about the whole situation. I saw one guy actually just have to go sit down. We hadn't even got to the execution yet. I went to see our prison chaplain. I kind of wondered where I stood doing what I was doing. I didn't mind doing my job, but yet I still had myself to deal with. And so I want to know where I stood in the eyes of God.
There's an unshakable feeling, being human, that what you're doing is murder, even though it's state-sanctioned legal killing. There's a very strong sense that they've killed a man. On the death certificate in Mississippi, the cause of death always was homicide.
It got me down. I was gotten sick. I'd gotten depressed. So when I had an opportunity to get out of it, I took it and I retired to get away from it.
But the lesson of history is that there will always be someone willing to throw a switch or pull a lever.
You unfortunately have a lot of very, very sick people in this world who would like to kill someone. It doesn't matter who, as long as they can kill someone.
And in a sense, executions have come full circle.
Florida hires their executioner through an ad in a 50-cent newspaper.
Nobody knows his name, who he is, where he's from. He is met some distance from the prison by prison officials. He places a mask on his head then and is driven to the prison.
The man does nothing but come in and push a switch, and yet he wears a veil.
No man wants to be pointed out as a killer, as someone who kills his fellow man.
You could say that it's for us or it's for the executioners, but in some ways you could also say it's for the prisoner. It's letting him know that he's going to meet somebody very dark. He's going to meet somebody who's so dark you can't even see his face.
America is the last major Western democracy to continue executing prisoners. And despite repeated attempts to search for a swift, certain, and humane method of delivering death, one that also shields the executioner from the consequences of his action, ultimately, someone will always feel responsible for taking life in cold blood. How do the executioners live with what they've seen and done?
The way I got involved in it, I was assigned by a superior. It become a part of my job. And even on up to the last one that I saw, of course I was warden then, that was my duty to see that it was done. So it was, each one I was involved in, it was a part of my job, so I accepted it as that.
I was doing what the state of Mississippi asked me to do with professionalism and dignity, as best you can do that. And of course I believed in the death penalty also. I would go into, I would execute again. I would do it again.